How do you feel about a big fat book? I'm talking one of those enormous bricks, the ones you're a little worried about reading in bed for fear of serious injury when nodding off. For me, there is something simultaneously delicious and slightly horrifying about such a thing. On the one hand, who has the time? And yet there's the anticipation of immersion, of an all-consuming indulgent reading experience. I love that feeling. But it puts a lot of pressure on the author and on the book. Does it have what it takes to grip, to compel? Is this a world where you're happy to give over and be consumed? Can you dip in and out amidst a busy life? You may have seen the new novel Caledonian Road around the place. This is a book that offers the exact nervous thrill of the epic. It weighs in at over 650 pages, a state-of-the-nation book, a portrait of a city. This very 21st century story is wrapped up in an ambitious 19th century form. There's even a cast of characters in the front, like in one of the Russian classics, introducing you to the more than 60 key players who inhabit and drive its sprawling story. Well, I'm happy to say it's an absolute bloody romp. And as the latest novel from literary journalist, 3-time Booker-nominated, much-loved author Andrew O'Hagan, that's hardly a surprise. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the stories behind them. Across half a dozen novels, Andrew O'Hagan has made a name for himself as an author of delicacy and grace. Novels like Be Near Me or The Missing, or 2020's intimate story of male friendship, Mayflies, paint the community he comes from in Scotland's west, with tenderness and wry, affectionate humour. So his decision to move to a work in such a different register is exciting, even if it is something of a departure. Caledonian Road follows a man at a turning point, art historian Campbell Flynn, who's about to come up against his own downfall. There's Russian oligarchs and minor aristocrats, newspaper columnists and factory workers. It is, in the best sense of the word, a Dickensian world he's created. So it's with Dickens that our conversation begins.
I grew up in quite a chaotic household. 4 boys, sort of absent father, hard-working mother, all of us, I think, living through quite difficult times for the country but also for the family. And I would hide away in that big house and read Victorian novels. I found Charles Dickens during that period, and I loved just curling up both physically and metaphorically with the wonderful sentences of Dickens and his penetrating way of going into human characters of different sorts, all sharing the same oxygen of that particular novel, being in the same weather of that book. Oh, I just loved those books. And I felt that they brought you to a place that nothing else could bring you to, a place of imaginative contentment. So I hope that when I grew up and became a big boy, I would... I'm still waiting for that to happen, actually. But along the way, I always had ambitions to write a big Victorian-style novel, but very much set in the modern day.
I'm glad you mentioned character, because it does seem to me, yes, there's lots to be said about the plotting, there's lots to be said about the social commentary, there's lots to be said about the comedy, and I think all of those are both present in his work and in Caledonian Road. But first and foremost, the thing that stays with me when I think about Dickens, when I revisit Dickens, is the characters. Both the big, larger-than-life ones, yes, and often just the little cameos, the walk-on characters who absolutely transfix you in a page or two and then are gone. He doesn't.
I'm glad you mentioned those, what we sometimes call secondary characters. There is something primary about them. By their nature, you shall know, the novelist, the quality of those secondary characters, the people who sometimes appear for a page or two. You know, Joe, the crossing sweeper in Bleak House, sort of carries the whole kind of moral ethos of the novel. He's only there for a page or two. He comes back and he's instrumental in the action in a big way. And I've certainly learnt a lot from that, is looking at the people who aren't obviously the leaders or the big colourful characters. They have colours that you need to observe. They have sides to their natures that will give you a fruitful sense of the whole story in the end. I have a character, Mrs. Voiles, who's a sitting tenant, as we say in London. That's to say a protected tenant living in an otherwise landlorded situation, but they have the right to remain in their room or their part of the house. These sitting tenants have become a real kind of symbol of what happened in contemporary London when the property prices went insane. And there were a number of new people to literature, including the sitting tenant, who I've never really read about in the volume that I wanted to read. A London character who has power in the situation that she's in, but also is in a hopeless predicament, can never own the house, can never own their part of it, but is condemned to watch while the landlord gets richer and richer. And in the ethos of a big place like London now, a Mrs. Voiles can become not just the fly in the ointment, the troublemaker, but somebody who wields subtle power in that situation. And if you're interested in money and relationships and belonging and power, as I am with Caledonian Road, then such a person becomes kind of fully alive. You know, her way of speaking, her way of thinking, the words that she uses, the fact that she's an ex-ballet dancer and she's always sort of extending her limbs as she stands there talking to people. She's a sort of whole existence to me.
She also embodies the kind of fundamental principle of drama, which is that her understanding of our tragic protagonist, Campbell Flynn, is entirely at odds with his understanding of himself. And so you have these two characters. Neither of them are wrong, particularly in their perception of one another. You know, she is difficult and cantankerous and everything else, and also she's a person with a rich inner life that he can't see. And likewise, he is the villainous landlord, even if we understand him to be something quite different, and he certainly understands himself to be.
You put it brilliantly, Michael. That is the central problem of a novel like this, is that you are people who they think they are. The reader has a privileged position. They have a private box on this drama. They get to see it from the best vantage point. That's to say, all vantage points. That's why a big novel like this should be dramatic and gripping and involving, because you, the reader, will know more than any of the individual characters do, even about themselves.
One of the wonderful kind of recurring refrains that happens through Caledonian Road, throughout the book, Campbell's wife Elizabeth, who is a very smart woman, a very insightful woman, a therapist, will, in talking to someone else about Campbell, offer us some insights, some really quite acute insights about who he is and what his limitations are. But the great tragedy of their marriage is that ultimately there are bits of him she can't see or can't know.
And can't impart some of these wisdoms. I mean, anybody who's been in even a good marriage, there are failures of identification, there are failures of sharing. You are, in the end, no matter how deeply married, you are divisible. You are individual. It's two human beings with two sets of DNA, came from different worlds, came from different universes, really, into each other's house, in each other's company, in each other's hearts. And what you watch, if you watch closely, is that no matter how bright they are, and no matter how open their marriage can be in so many ways, that there are things hidden from each other. And again, that's part of the drama of a book like this, is trying to unfold. Poor Campbell Flynn, my central character, a man in his 50s, an art historian, appears to have everything. He has the big wedding cake of a house in North London, in Islington, which has gained and gained and gained in value through the last 2 decades. He has 2 very, very bright children doing interesting things in the world. As you say, he has a fantastic wife, a bright and beautiful woman who has her own pursuits. And he has the career that any art historian, any writer in contemporary life might imagine would be wonderful. But there's something wrong at the centre of Campbell Flynn. Something is off in his life. And the drama of the book takes that up. But it's not always the case that he can see it himself. Largely, he can't see it. The people around him, as you've suggested, are the ones who really slowly and incrementally bring the news to the reader about what's off about this guy who should have everything, but at some level is absolutely falling apart.
It's very base to be concerned with questions of sympathy when it comes to literature, I think, and fiction. But I am curious, if not about Campbell specifically, about the type that he represents. You know, if this liberal, successful, moneyed, white, middle-aged man is in a moment of crisis, and if it is in part, as I think the book suggests, a crisis that comes from a kind of reckoning, a second guessing of what it means to be good and the nature of privilege,
Absolutely.
for lack of a better phrase. Is that a reckoning that's overdue?
I think it's always overdue if you're a really moral society. It's always overdue that everything be questioned. I mean, we're all on a clock. None of us get to, sidestep the big questions, including some that you've already elucidated for us. Am I a good man? Is a question that no man should be allowed to sidestep on account of his position or his authority or his money or his social status. We've lived through the years when men could, and I say men advisedly, men have been able to sidestep the big questions because they're covered in privilege and concealment. In all our societies, I'm talking about contemporary London in this book, but it could be many societies in which the cloak of decency and respectability has been so tightly wrapped around these guys who are privileged that the question, are you actually good? In your moneyed position of self-satisfaction and fairness and self-conscious goodness, have you ever actually given anything up for people poorer than you? I mean, they could ask that of me. They could ask it of any of us. And I think novelists should be in a position to ask these questions, and very often of their targets for these questions are not the people who would normally be asked them. We find it easy to criticise people on the right, greedy oligarchs, or fantastically self-involved industrialists who think of themselves as being separate to society, media figures who think they're above it all. We find them easy to bring down, and there's plenty of literature that does bring them down. But what about the people who are asking the questions of them? What happens if you turn the tables and you say to the Campbell Flynns of this world, with their amazing professorships at London universities, with their regular contributions to The New Yorker, with their appearances on the Today programme of the BBC every morning, these respectable, utterly trustworthy voices, what if we, as readers or as creative artists, turn and say, and what about you then? What have you given up recently to address the great inequalities in our society? Or are you, like the people you profess to hate, covered in privilege, concealed, if you like, by status? So I think it's right that their time has come around. And when I say they, by the way, I mean me.
Yeah.
My time has come around. A white, middle-aged, liberal, possibly successful journalist who gets to publish whatever he wants, gets to make announcements on the radio and in lovely podcasts like this. I think it's time for self-questioning to come into my work.
At the start of that, though, you said that reckoning is due in a moral society. But one of the things that's very clear in Caledonian Road is you are not positing contemporary Britain, certainly, but the contemporary world in general, as a moral society. This is a place that is deeply broken.
I think that's right. And the brokenness becomes, if you like, the landscape of this book. That London's lively and colourful and in many ways adorable and beautiful and admirable, but it's also become a place which could be, mistaken for a modern-day Casablanca, the place where somebody wanting to park a dodgy fortune would choose London over many other places, because it's easy to buy luxury housing and it's easy to buy artworks of a magnitude that you wouldn't believe. Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of Modigliani's can be bought via London without much checking going on. So if you have an offshore account, as all the oligarchs did, and not only the oligarchs, by the way, minor royals, industrialists, individuals from all over the world flocking to London in the last 25 years, this deregulated city, Tony Blair advertised it as a new glittering glass and steel deregulated zone. His successor, Gordon Brown, gave out what they called golden visas to industrialists and entrepreneurs from around the world who wanted to park themselves in London and their fortunes. And then, of course, since then, David Cameron and his wild enthusiasm for foreign money and foreign investment, and Boris Johnson, the age of Johnson, going beyond satire, beyond ridiculousness, in my opinion, to make welcome oligarchs as proprietors of newspapers in London, in some cases as members of the House of Lords. This is a society breaking down before our eyes, using hospitality as a kind of means to corrupt the equation to make the very living economy a sort of living hypocrisy, where people who are poor are getting poorer and people who are rich are getting not only richer but more protected in their richness, while austerity reigns. We've lived through austerity in Britain, through a migrant crisis, through, like most other places, a pandemic. And in the middle of all this, what we saw governments do was to make the people who had too much more safe in their too muchness, whilst benefits were cut, housing was falling apart, and people who were poorer in that society were in a rougher position. That is why novelists, under the shadow of, say, Dickens, come into play and say, well, let me dramatise this happening. Not in a self-serving way, because I, in my generation, don't come out particularly well from this story. I'm very happy to take that on the chin. I devised, if you like, a mousetrap in which I'd be one of the people who the cage come down on. But, you know, if you're going to criticise society, you should involve yourself if you're a novelist, in my view.
And there's almost no art form like the novel that can have you move with such grace and speed from a country estate to a billionaire's penthouse to a housing estate.
Not with that level of subtlety, Michael. I'd agree with you. I mean, of course, we are, you know, delightedly living through the era of the box set of the great television drama, the serial drama, of which this will become one. I'm sure we'll talk about that in due course. But the extended television drama has mimicked the great tradition of the novel in going from scene to scene, from high to low, from, as it were, the oligarch's vast sitting room in Chelsea to a tower block where poor people are living in South London. But I would argue that the novel has the premium energy, the subtlety. It can go inside the minds of the people in those dwellings, as well as into the dwellings themselves.
When we return, Andrew shares the secret to writing a successful satire and reveals why Caledonian Road might be his most optimistic book yet. We'll be right back. This is a comic novel. This is a comedy of manners. It's a big social satire. And comedy relies on specificity, and it relies on jokes not being at your character's expense, but situations being deeply funny in and of themselves.
I think that's what comedy is, you know, and you've mentioned satire, and I think it's one of the great forms. And you need to have an absolute determination to depict if you're going to be a satirist. And the depictions have got to be as specific as they can be. You know, no writer worth her salt sits around worrying about whether they're entitled to represent things or not. They just use all five senses and the deepest intelligence that they can apply to make these things alive and comical and true in all the ways that they can. And they'll leave it to other people to worry about whether permission has to be sought. In my opinion, I will never require to ask permission to do something with my brain, which I feel I'm entitled to do. And that's just a human right, as far as I'm concerned. And it's one that I would fight to extend to people of all classes, colours and creeds. But satire is a whole subject in its own. And it depends on this one big thing, a relationship between the classical and the topical, you know. And I spent as much time on the one half as on the other, working out classically how to create on the page a structure and a movement of voice and tone, dialogue and action that would somehow bring this comedy to fruition. And at the same time, the other half that goes with classical, topical. That's why I kept shunting the action through the 10 years of this book's writing closer and closer to the present day, because I wanted the novel that eventually landed in your desk and the desks and on the bookshelves of people all over the world to be as up to the minute as it could be. Classical meets topical.
Yeah.
That's the heart of the book.
So then where in the writing of it did you find surprise? Like, given the nature of it, given what we've said about the nature of the plotting, how kind of intricately, this is a big machine, like the city that it's writing about. This is a machine with lots of moving parts that are dependent on each other and have links to. I imagine you at home with a serial killer pinboard with red string on it, linking the characters, explain, okay, this person to that person. Did things take a life of their own during that process, or are you much more methodical than that?
No, I think both things are true. It's thoroughly methodical, but within the method, within everything that's, as it were, ordained by the plotting and the structuring and the research and the pinboard with the mad bits of string going from one thing. I used to look at it some days and say, look up there, it's an unbeautiful mind. This complete sort of elaboration of these characters that I'd started with 10 years ago. I'd brought them into company with each other because, as in life, we do share the same oxygen, as it turns out. We can make a mania of our differences if we like, but actually there's red blood going through our veins, and something of our communality was always going to be the central engine of this big State of the Nation novel. But I have to say, I was surprised again and again how a well-invented character will begin to behave as themselves. And that happens to writers, not just because of writers. As the writer yourself, you begin to see it happening under your fingers, Michael. You can see as you're pressing the keys that your fingers are going for letters that were not preordained. Nothing was set in stone. Suddenly, your character's speaking a line that they, I would argue, in the sort of solidity of their character, want to say. And it's a lot of the specific comedy that comes into a book like this comes from characters just beginning to announce themselves as they should do. It's a bit like acting in that way. If you're a good actor, you can learn your lines. But a really great performance, an Al Pacino moment, is when he begins to speak fully in character. He begins to say things that they're not on the page. Some of the greatest unscripted scenes in movies like The Godfather, or Godfather 2, are just when the characters are so immersed, they've travelled so far into what they believe to be the reality and the truth of their character, that they just start to speak as them. And that happens to novelists under their fingertips, that your characters do have the power to surprise you, and sometimes surprise you in mega ways. I've jumped back from my chair once or twice in the writing of this book when I realised that a character had just predicted their own death, had just determined their own fate. Now, I look back at the board and I see that the string didn't go that way.
Yeah.
They determined it. Now, of course, there's hocus pocus in that, and of course, I directed it. I'm the one writing it. But I can tell you with all sails up, when you're really sailing as a novelist, that the characters begin to tell you something you didn't know.
Then that question of surprise, the counterweight to it, is inevitability. And while this is a comic novel, it is also a tragedy. It's several different tragedies. It's the tragedy of contemporary Britain and the tragedy of money.
Yes.
And the inevitability of people coming to a sticky end.
Yes.
Are you a pessimist?
I don't think I am, funnily enough. This is my most optimistic book. I mean, I see you smiling. I'm not surprised because, many readers, seeing the accumulation of debts and fates and the accumulation of losses in a book like this, think, oh my God, a lot's crumbling. But a lot of it had to crumble in order for the new optimistic age to happen. And I would say that not just the young people, some of them aren't particularly young who notice this, but the fate of Campbell Flynn and of London and of many of the major forces in this book is to clear the decks for something truer. And I really believe that the warrior of Milo Mangasha, my young student who questions everything, he's a sort of moral hacker, he's a pest, he's a disruptor, but he really does, I think, without spoilers, disrupt. And I think that our societies are up for disruption at the moment, as never before. That change doesn't just happen because it's time for a change. Change has to be forced, has to be enacted, has to be invented. We live in the end not in countries that are settled places. They're just imagined communities. We imagined them into being. Australia doesn't really exist as a thing outside of human beings imagining it. It was human beings that make Australia, made it in the first place and continue to remake it through their imagination and the power of their fictive energy. That is an imagined community. So it has to be reimagined by every generation or every few generations in order to address the problems of before. And that's what this novel's about. It's my most optimistic because it sees an arrow going out of the present troubles, out of contemporary Britain, into something cleaner, truer, fairer, more representative. And that, for me, is something I've never been able to do before. This is my 10th book. But even in Mayflies, the one just before, which was taken up as a great clarion call to friendship and to camaraderie and to, the common experience of living, actually, this is the most optimistic.
You're talking about the kind of redemptive power of the novel and fiction and the ways in which that makes this ultimately an optimistic work. It makes me think of that great Gramsci line, the old world is dying and the new world's not ready to be born. So
yes.
This is the time of monsters.
Yes.
And that came to mind when I was reading Caledonian Road, that this kind of generationalism was almost as powerful an engine as money in this book. And the ways in which different generations fail to talk to one another and fail to understand one another.
You put it very beautifully, and I would agree with that. In fact, that was why I spent 10 years writing this book, because I felt that conversation between the generations was becoming moribund. I think this novel can allow for voices to coalesce around subjects in a way that they were failing to coalesce in the media or in education or in society at large. I don't just mean my novel. I mean any novel that is worth its salt in these times should create the conditions which temporarily, I hope, don't exist in society for, as it were, a multiple analysis of where we are. Because we live in very singular-minded times in the sense that people who don't agree with each other at the moment are so partisan to their own view. They don't just disagree with the opposition, they want to annihilate the opposition. They want the opposition not to exist as part of their programme of existing. And that describes American politics to me. It describes civilian life in the UK. It describes arguments between generations, creeds, colours. There are arguments which have been allowed to become dehumanised. And I think the novelist has a role in that she can insert herself or himself into the debate at a level too deep for tears. At a level, as Wordsworth said, which is recollection in tranquility. Sometimes we need the tranquility, and society doesn't give that in debate at the moment. There's no room for the tranquil. There's only room for the shouty, the angry, and the mercilessly deaf when it comes to their opposition's rights and arguments. I like the opposition's arguments in the sense I don't agree with them. I want to allow them the same volume as mine so that we live in a society of pluralism, And that's what a novel can do, in my view.
I think you demonstrate that to be the case. Thank God for the novel. Thank God for you. Thank you for coming in, Andrew O'Hagan.
Thank you, Michael. What a pleasure.
Andrew O'Hagan's latest novel, Caledonian Road, is out now. And if you're looking for something a little more on the slender side, his Mayflies, which came out in 2020, is a beautiful, tender story about a friendship spanning 30 years. It's really wonderful. Before we go, I wanted to briefly pay tribute to the singular and extraordinary Alice Munro. She's a personal favourite for many years, and she died earlier this week at the age of 92. She's best known for her short stories, which are as good an example of the form as you'll see anywhere, but my tip is go to her novel of interconnected stories, Lives of Girls and Women. It is a classic, and I reread it every couple of years because I love it so much. Vale Alice Munro. You can find Munro's books and all the others we've mentioned in this episode at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, tell your friends, tell the internet, tell anyone who'll listen. You can rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Next week on Read This, I chat with writer, director, actor, artist Miranda July about her new novel, All Fours.
When I was making my last movie, Cajillionaire, I was pretty much done with that, done writing it, if not shooting it. When I began to have all these ideas, these just questions, even on the set of that movie, I was talking with Deborah Winger and my producer about aging. But, I wrote down things they said in my notes, and I knew this isn't Cajillionaire. This is novel 2, which is what the file was called for a long time. Novel 2.
Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames, mixing and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcho. And a thank you to Melbourne Writers Festival, who brought Andrew O'Hagan to our shores in the first place. Thanks for listening. See you next week.